Great. Well, maybe we can get started. I am going to introduce myself to start. My name is Shannon Wells, and this is my third week at Livepeer. I'm so excited to have recently joined Livepeer Inc. as head of community and governance, and have been spending the last few weeks just getting to know this amazing community. And I'm really excited to host my first community call with you all. It's great. And this is the quarterly Transcoder call that's been happening for a while. And I'm really excited to kick this one off to talk about a really exciting update for the project around verification improvements. And this is going to be the focus for today's agenda is this exciting update. We have Doug on the line. I think he's in a taxi cab somewhere, and I don't even know where in the world he is, but he's going to be speaking in a minute to provide some context for this update. We have Yondon Fu, who's our director of engineering, and I think maybe one or two of his team members who will be giving an overview of the fast and full verification design and just kind of what's been going on under the hood, and most importantly, what that means for our orchestrators. And this calls an opportunity for you all to ask questions of Yondon and the team. I think Doug's going to be hanging around for as long as he can, who can maybe field some questions as well, but he may have to sign off. And then, because we do have 60 minutes, I would like to take a little bit of time at the end of this call to talk about the next quarterly Transcoder call and what's on the horizon for that, as well as take anyone's feedback on how these calls have gone for you all. And in my new role as head of community, would just love to get your feedback on how we can improve these calls going forward. So with that, I also want to remind everyone, that we are live streaming this meeting at livepeer.org/TV. And I want to thank my colleague Adam for making that happen behind the scenes. And the chat is open for questions. So obviously, post any of your chats, comments during the meeting there, and then we can pick them up in live discussion after the presentation. So thank you all for being here. And Doug, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon, for kicking this off. And yeah, for those of you who haven't had the chance to meet Shannon yet, she's Shan on the Discord, and has been an incredible addition to the community in the couple of short weeks that we're here. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with her, telling her how you're feeling about participating in Livepeer. Let her know your ideas for the community, for the project, what we can all be doing better collectively. And it'll be a kind of great way to keep the ideas flowing and dialogue open. Thanks, Shannon. Cool. Also, yeah, sorry I couldn't be on video and presenting as I usually am. I'm in transit right now, but I just wanted to join to kind of set the table for this big update that we just released yesterday. Talk a little bit about how I view it and why it's important, and then I'll kick it over to Yondon and the team for some of the details. Cool. So there's a new Livepeer node release out. And it has this kind of big feature enabled that we're calling fast verification. And it's part of the fast plus full verification design. But taking a big step back, I want to talk about what that is and why it's important. So one of the key promises of blockchain technology is that it can actually create these open, permissionless systems where no one needs to trust one another. They can just trust kind of the rules of the game and the rules of the protocol as they're encoded in the protocol and smart contracts. And that's really powerful. It's the basis for this open financial system without intermediaries. It's the basis for these new open Web3 compute platforms. And in the case of Livepeer, it's the basis for an open video infrastructure where you can, stream video through the network. You can trust that any node operator around the world is encoding this video correctly. You can insert it back into your stream, serve it to your users without, needing to have contractual obligations with underlying providers, or deal with middlemen to reduce risk. And all this can be enabled by cryptography and, computer science and economics and blockchain code. And so when we designed the initial Livepeer protocol 4.5 years ago, it's crazy thinking it's been that long. we kind of laid out this verification scheme using a protocol called TrueBit, which could allow the blockchain to basically, prove and determine and give economic security that your computation or your video transcoding was done correctly. And that scheme works well when you have what's called deterministic algorithms that compute the same result every time on input data. And there's even further restrictions when those algorithms are being run on the same hardware architectures, such that that the math is being done the same way on the underlying chips. And that idea works well in theory. We had this kind of proof of concept implementation in the early days of the network that could secure CPU-based transcoding. That was the first form of work available on Livepeer. And since then, Livepeer has definitely expanded in the video technology world, become more efficient and performant for live streaming. We've been able to tap into GPUs for GPU-based transcoding. And in fact, that's really the way to scale cost effectively and to disrupt the existing closed centralized providers. But these GPUs run lots of different hardware architectures. They're not doing deterministic computation. And so you actually need different verification techniques in order to be able to trust the results that come out of this. And it's been an open research area. There's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into a bunch of different experiments with different video fingerprinting techniques, AI techniques, different types of approaches here. But we're really excited to kind of unveil and release one of the first implementations of the first pieces of a new verification mechanism that we're calling fast plus full verification. And the idea here is, when a broadcast node sends video to any operator on the network, they receive the encoded video back. And what they need to do is they need to very quickly, or in a fast manner, gain enough trust that they can insert that video segment into their streams and it hasn't been tampered with. And they can do that with a pretty high degree of confidence, a pretty high degree of reliability, but there's still a slight risk that that video may have been tampered with, it may have been attacked. And in order to remove or prevent that risk, there's actually the second component, this full verification that can be performed. But that's slow and it's expensive, and you don't want to do it all the time. You can't do it fast enough in order to keep your live stream up to date. So knowing that this full verification can be done later, what you can do is you can say, well, if they fail that, then there really needs to be a severe economic penalty, such that even if someone wanted to attack you in the short term, they might be able to, but there would be a really high cost to doing that because they would lose a lot of stake. And that's where the full verification process comes in. So it's fast verification gives you a high degree of confidence that you can trust the segment. And if you don't have that confidence, you just maybe work with another provider quickly, or you encode one segment yourself to keep up with real-time stream. And then you deal with kind of the full verification process later that's secured by economic security. And that's the kind of basis behind this design. There's a lot of kind of intricate techniques under the hood and a lot of still, iteration and research to do. But, excited that this week we were able to release the first update with the first version of the fast verifier. Enabled, we'll be able to use that to collect and observe data, see how it's performing, see what challenges it creates, and kind of work towards the long-term solution, which is super powerful and really critical to achieving this mission of being the world's open infrastructure, being a truly open marketplace that everyone can trust and use without additional cost. And so I'll stop there. I'll hand it over to Yondon and team for technical details. But before I do, I can't see the chat. I can't see if anyone's prompting visually. If anyone wants to chime in and add anything or ask any clarifying questions, just at the high level, happy to answer for a few minutes.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but do want to give any folks on the line a chance to ask you a question directly if anyone wants to do that now before you have to jump off.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Cool. Can you just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Dion. I run a Titan node. one of the orchestrators in Livepeer currently. The question I have is for the full verification, you talk about slashing or at least an economic penalty for not being able to fully verify. When would that go live in terms of actually putting out that penalty for when somebody cannot or does sends back in transcoded stuff that's incorrect? Like, when would that go live, and how would that look kind of in further detail?
Yeah, great question. So there's a bunch of different considered mechanisms that could be used to both, do that adjudication of the encoding being correct or not for that. And that's part of that is going to be determined by what we see with fast verification being live before the slashing is enabled, what the data looks like, what the statistics look like, where someone is honestly acting, but maybe encoded a segment that didn't pass the fast verification, even though they weren't doing anything malicious. That can inform the different techniques and approaches for full. There's no timeline yet, but obviously it's a high priority to get there. The other thing I would say is, like, this fast verification it's an off-chain process, right? It's in the client. It's your broadcast node will check this off-chain and it'll make decisions what to do based on it. And it doesn't require any governance action or anything. It's a software upgrade. But as you mentioned, the full verification may come with economic penalties, whether that's slashing or being prevented from cashing in payments for a period of time, or freezing or deactivating of your node for a period of time. Those are like on-chain protocol updates, and that would require governance and community consensus to enact. And I think the community that's on this call and the orchestrators on the network are going to be kind of instrumental in the feedback and iteration process to make sure that mechanism is in a way that's risk-free for honest actors and works well, secures and helps the network, and ultimately creates the thing that everyone can trust building open applications on.
Cool. Thank you for asking or answering.
Sure.
Great question, Dion, and thanks, Doug. Does anyone else have a question for Doug? And just time check, Doug. When do you have to drop off?
Yeah, probably 5 or 10 minutes. So sorry, I'm going to miss all the fun.
Okay, no worries. Does anyone else have a question for Doug now that we've got him on the hot seat? Okay.
All right, the team will share more exciting details anyway. So I can hand it off now.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Travel safe.
Yep.
Great, and now I'm going to hand it over to Yondon for a bit more color on what's happening.
Sure, thanks. So I think in order to go through the next bit of content, I'm going to share my screen just so that we have some visuals to go along with my ramblings. Let's see, share my screen. Cool. Can I just get a verbal thumbs up from someone that they can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about I'm going to talk about a few things. I'll spend most of my time focusing on this fast verification topic that was just introduced. I'll also frame it a little bit by talking about the broader fast and full verification design, just so that we can understand how fast verification fits in to the bigger verification picture. And then we can talk a little bit about what to expect in the coming weeks with regards to fast verification, since that's being immediately rolled out in the next bit of time. So to start off with, and I'll loop back to this towards the end. If you're an orchestrator operator or a node operator, I think many of you should be aware of the fact that there is a new node release that came out yesterday. This is version 0.5.21. What we're looking at here is the release page on GitHub with the release notes, along with the binaries that you can download in order to run an updated version of the software for your orchestrator/transcoder nodes. And this release is important because as mentioned in the release notes, it includes a specific capability which is required for fast verification. And we'll get into exactly what that capability is momentarily. But the most important thing for Orchestrator operators to know is that this capability, because it's required for fast verification that is run on the broadcaster side, it's important for Orchestrator operators to be on this release as soon as possible to ensure that they'll be able to continue serving broadcasters that run fast verification. So for example, the broadcasters that are run as a part of the livepeer.com API hosted service would be upgraded to a version that runs fast verification. And in order to continue serving those broadcasters and receiving that work, you'll need to be on this latest release. So this is just something that happened yesterday. I encourage people to check out the release notes, and we'll talk a little more about the details momentarily, but wanted to start off with that. But what is fast verification? I think the best place to start is this forum post that we published, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, which is called Transcoding Verification Improvements, Fast and Full Verification. I think Doug has already given a pretty good overview of the history of how transcoding is verified on the Livepeer network. So I'll skip over that section, but there's a few bullet points here for anyone that's interested that wants to get into more of the details historically. But I think a good starting point before jumping into fast verification is to mention where we are today and how that has informed what fast verification needs to look like, which ended up influencing the design of fast verification a lot. So where we are today is that, as Doug mentioned, kind of hairy problem within Livepeer is that the transcoded results are by default not deterministic. So we can't just say, oh, was this transcoded result exactly the same as this other transcoded result? Because depending on what hardware you use, what your setup looks like, it might represent the same exact video content, but bit for bit, it might not be the same, right? Like visually, if you play it in a video player, you're like, oh, it's the same exact video. But then under the hood, when the computer checks it, it says, oh, there's like 100 bits that are different or 10 bits that are different, even though visually the video is exactly the same. So in order to address that, previous research involved answering the question of, well, how do we even detect if two transcoded results or a transcoded result and an original video segment correspond to the same visual content? And if the transcoded result does not correspond to the original visual content, we consider that as quote unquote tampering. So the background here was that we did a bunch of research and we had a collaboration with another video technology focused company in the industry. And we actually published a paper on this, I think a year or two ago. I have a link to it here, which is the paper was called Video Tampering Detection for Decentralized Video Transcoding Networks. And it was a collaboration between certain members of the Livepeer Inc. core team, as well as this other video technology company called Haivision. And in that paper, we explained how you could construct a machine learning model that takes two pieces of video and asks the question, well, is there tampering that took place, or is the visual content represented by the video exactly the same? And we should consider these as kind of verified videos. So yeah, I think people can check out that paper if they're interested, if they're more academically inclined. But that was the research that went into it. And as a result, what happened in practice is that we created this verification classifier, which is something that basically went through this process using that machine learning model. And this is something that a broadcaster would be able to run on its own in order to verify video that it gets back from the network. But it had a bunch of shortcomings, and the forum post gets into them, but kind of long story short, while this improved the security guarantees for the broadcaster, it increased the amount of burden and latency that the broadcaster had for the stream. So even though functionally speaking, it was a solution, it was not the ideal solution to this problem. So that kind of leads us into fast verification. So we know that we want these security guarantees and we want improved security around whether the video is actually tampered or legit, but we don't want to hurt the end experience for the live stream, because if the end experience for the live stream is hurt a substantial amount, it might not even matter that you know if the video is legit or not, because it might be too late for the end user, and no one wants to, everyone in live streaming wants to minimize latency, not increase it, right? So this fast verification section in the forum post gets into the technical details of the design. And I think what I'll highlight here is that this design is basically predicated on the idea that we want to offload as much of the hard work away from the broadcaster and to the orchestrators, who are the ones that have the hardware and have the bandwidth already. So in order to do that, at a high level, what this involves is asking the orchestrator to compute some additional data about the video, about the transcoded results that it's going to give back to the broadcaster, and sending that additional data back to the broadcaster so the broadcaster can use that extra data to compare against other extra data that it receives from other orchestrators. In practice, that extra data is what's called a perceptual hash. Once again, feel free to take a look at this separately, but there's an entire body of research on this in the video, image, and computer vision industry, where a perceptual hash is basically a very small fingerprint or very small representation of a piece of media, such as video, where if you compare two perceptual hashes generated for a video, it will tell you whether they represent the same video. And this is different from cryptographic hashes, which I think more people are familiar with, because cryptographic hashes, if any small piece of the data is different, it's going to result in a completely different hash. While with perceptual hashes, if a small piece of the data is different, but it still represents the same visual content, the perceptual hashes are going to be very similar, such that we consider them a match. So that's the main difference. So the orchestrators are going to be responsible for computing these perceptual hashes in addition to the transcoded results, and they're going to be sent back to the broadcaster. If you want a better visual representation of this, this is my very poor attempt at that, where what happens right now, a broadcaster sends a segment to an orchestrator and it gets back transcoded results. With fast verification, a broadcaster sends the segment to the orchestrator and it gets back transcoded results and perceptual hashes. So if it gets back 3 transcoded results, it gets back 3 perceptual hashes, and each of those hashes correspond with one of those results, basically saying, hey, this is a demonstration that I actually transcoded this result correctly. I'm giving you the perceptual hash for that result. So that's helpful for the broadcaster, but what does the broadcaster do with that data afterwards? And here's, I think, where is the slightly more interesting part, and what's described in the forum post, where because the broadcaster gets back perceptual hashes in addition to the results, now it can actually use those hashes to compare against hashes returned by other orchestrators. So what's proposed in the forum post is the broadcaster, instead of working with a single orchestrator, the broadcaster can, at a regular frequency, send the same segment to multiple orchestrators and not only get back the results for the video segment, but also get back the perceptual hashes for the video segment. And this is going to happen for each of the different orchestrators. So you see here, we have orchestrator 1, orchestrator 2, orchestrator 3, and the broadcaster at the end of this process is going to have hashes from each of them. And then the broadcaster is going to run a process to check the hashes against each other and determine, did each of these orchestrators pass fast verification? Meaning, did the perceptual hashes actually match together, indicating that the visual content of the underlying video would be roughly the same. The one tweak here is that we introduced this concept, this distinction between trusted and untrusted orchestrators, although I'm not sure if that's the best terminology here. It's actually not so much that you you're trusting one particular orchestrator and not trusting the others. I think a better distinction might be high reputation versus low reputation, where the idea is that there's going to be certain orchestrators that a broadcaster has worked consistently with that just has more information about via continued use of the network. So these orchestrators would be considered high reputation orchestrators, or the broadcaster can consider them high reputation orchestrators. They just know more about them. And then there's always going to be orchestrators where the broadcaster has never worked with them, has no understanding of what their behavior looks like, and those would be lower reputation orchestrators. In the forum post, we just simplify and say trusted versus untrusted, but there's a little bit of extra detail there. And the way that we make use of this is we actually use the high reputation orchestrators to check the work of the low reputation orchestrators. And then through that process, the low reputation orchestrators can gain reputation in the eyes of the broadcaster, because through this process, the broadcaster gets to work with more orchestrators and learn more about them. So it's not that you're only ever going to quote unquote trust certain orchestrators and not trust other ones. You basically use higher reputation orchestrators to learn more about lower reputation orchestrators, so they could potentially become high reputation orchestrators later on from the point of view of the broadcaster. So in practice, what happens is the broadcaster is going to use at least one high reputation orchestrator, and then also work with a few untrusted orchestrators or lower reputation orchestrators, and then use the perceptual hashes returned by the high reputation orchestrator as sort of the source of truth, where the perceptual hashes returned by the lower reputation orchestrators then get checked against that. So if you don't match the perceptual hash returned by a high reputation orchestrator, then it's considered a failure. And using that kind of detection mechanism, if it's a failure, then we know that, well, they failed the fast verification process in this instance. And that is information that the broadcaster can use to determine which orchestrators to continue sending video segments to.
Yondon, just a quick question on that.
Yep.
Dan raised another great question in the chat. Will the fast verification cause any delays in the performance of the live streams?
Yep, I think that's a great question. So the fast verification process should not cause delays in, at least relative to kind of the way the system works today, should not cause additional delays to the live stream. However, it is worth noting that it will require some additional bandwidth on the broadcaster end, just because it's sending out more data and receiving more data. But generally, we think that's going to be acceptable in most cases, given that kind of where you run a broadcaster, you're going to need a reasonable amount of bandwidth to begin with, because video streams require a kind of sizable amount of bandwidth. But that's something that you can also tweak. So we don't think that it'll involve additional delays, but there will be some bandwidth usage increase. Does that answer the question?
Sorry, I was on mute. Dion, did that answer your question? I know you also had a follow-up around your question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess from experience, I guess having a live stream, one of the major sticking points is making sure that the quality of the live stream is in real time, and that there's no delays or missed frames. And so, by what you're proposing, I guess this wouldn't cause frames to get lost, but I wonder if other orchestrators, say no other orchestrator comes back to verify that initial hash, does it drop the orchestrator currently transcoding, or does it continue on with it until it's proven that it's incorrect? Like, would there ever be a point where it would switch if it doesn't get verifications from other orchestrators?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's a good question. So the current thought process is that in a scenario where you don't get back enough hashes, let's say, so without the hashes, you can't run the fast verification process. I think this is where like the distinction between high reputation and low reputation orchestrators comes into play as well, where one of the factors that goes into kind of having access, having more reputation as orchestrator is your continued performance and on the network. So latency is a big factor there. So the higher reputation orchestrators, at least based on historical data, are going to have kind of consistently solid performance, being able to return the transcoded results in time. So the current thought process is that if the lower reputation orchestrators that you send out the segment to don't come back in time, you have a fallback mechanism where you can fall back to the higher reputation orchestrator that sent back the transcoded result, presumably in a reasonable amount of time. And this is also something that you can choose, right? So you can choose, if you're not comfortable with immediately using the result given back by the higher reputation orchestrator, and you're not comfortable with that security model, you can choose not to opt into that. You can say, no, instead, I want to wait for kind of a sufficient amount of hashes to be checked before I'll use it. But the default can be to just use the result given back to you by the higher reputation orchestrator if none of the lower reputation orchestrators responded in time. And I think this is mentioned a little bit in the forum post around like the logic for discarding orchestrators from consideration if they either fail their fast verification or don't return a result within a reasonable amount of time.
Great. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Just one quick other follow-up question, just because this actually happened to my node recently, like last night, where it actually went down for about 6 hours because of an invalid memory error, and I had to restart it. But during that time, it was not transcoding, and my uptime had fallen to 50%. So the question is, if you have low uptime or unstable connection, or you're just getting started, will having low uptime have a negative effect on your reputation for that fast verification process?
Yeah, so the question is if you are sporadically offline just due to technical issues with your setup, is that just going to forever mean that you're going to have low reputation in the eyes of broadcasters that use the network? And I think I definitely don't think you would want it to be the case where, let's say there is just a period of time where the setup is doing poorly because you're just getting up to speed. I definitely don't think you would want that to be like have a permanent damaging effect, but you do want to factor that in, right? So it's like if that setup isn't working particularly well, it's like down a lot. I think the broadcaster is definitely gonna kind of factor that in when it actually determines like whether this is like reputation accruing or taking away from reputation. But that being said, I think the broadcaster, in order to not overly penalize the orchestrator for something like that, can also bias towards more recent events versus older events, right? So it's like if in the past you had a period of time where the setup was offline all the time, yeah, like that's going to be a ding from a reputational view standpoint. But if you then improve it substantially going forward, then that can be weighted more, right? Because ultimately the broadcaster cares most about what's happening in the present and what's going to happen in the future. So it could make sense to weight events that have happened more recently versus events that happened in the past. So I think that could be one way to balance those two considerations, where if it's offline all the time, I think the broadcaster is going to need to factor that in for sure and have that be a ding to reputation, but can kind of lessen the impact by weighing events that happen more recently, so that if you make drastic improvements to it, such that going forward you're doing perfectly fine, the broadcaster can factor that in more.
Yeah. Thank you very much for answering that. I do think that having a good uptime and the reliability to broadcasters is pretty paramount. So I don't think that it's a negative thing to have them penalized, but Just wanted to ask that question and get your thoughts. So thanks for answering.
Totally.
Great question, Sion. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is a good pausing point for fast verification as well. So yeah, are there any additional questions regarding anything that we've gone through thus far? Cool. If not, then I'll move forward and kind of wrap up the fast verification discussion. So we've gone over kind of the building blocks for fast verification. So it's this perceptual hash algorithm. It's this process of using multiple orchestrators, having this distinction between higher reputation and lower reputation orchestrators in order to inform how we check the hashes returned by different orchestrators. The last thing that I'll mention here is that, of course, what happens if someone actually fails fast verification, right? So if I think there can be two possible cases there. The first case is the more natural and obvious case, which is someone actually just returned the complete, like they're running a piece of software that is not actually doing the transcoding and is not actually computing the right perceptual hash, and they return the wrong hash and they fail fast verification. So that's one case. Another case, which is the slightly trickier one, is that the perceptual hash algorithm is a statistical technique. And what I mean by that is that there is always going to be a small possibility of false negatives when you compare perceptual hashes together. And a false negative in this context is if there were two hashes that did indeed correspond to the same video. So it's like if you took the videos, you looked at them, you computed the hashes, and then the hashes don't match for some reason when you think that they would, because you saw the videos were almost identical, but the hashes don't match. And this is a possibility just because the algorithm is statistical. There's going to be a certain false negative rate where certain data samples are going to be misclassified. And that's something that's pretty inconvenient, right? So we can't just say that we're always going to be in the first scenario I just described, where if you fail fast verification, it immediately means that you did something incorrect. There is a small possibility that you might fail fast verification, but you did everything correct. And this is just due to the false negative rate in the algorithm. In going forward, I think this is something that we would want to continuously improve on. Like you always want to be using the best algorithm that has the lowest possible false negative rate. So that's something that we can do. Just continuously try to see how much you can minimize that. Separately, because we know that it's probably never going to be 100% in terms of accuracy, there's always going to be like a small percentage chance of there being a false negative rate. We need to factor that in to the design for fast verification. So there's a case where someone actually did something wrong because they failed fast verification. And then there's the case where they didn't do anything wrong, but they failed fast verification. And you need to be able to distinguish between those two cases. Luckily, we do know what the kind of false negative rate, generally speaking, the algorithm is going to have. So maybe that's like 1% or 2%. And then we can actually use that as information to design how to behave when fast verification fails. So rather than say, oh, this person failed fast verification, we're never going to work with this orchestrator again, the broadcaster doesn't want to do that because it knows there can be false negatives. So rather than do that, the broadcaster is going to actually keep track of the frequency of failed fast verifications, where if you fail fast verification immediately, we're not going to use the results given to you. But that does not, we're not going to use the results that you give back to us for an end user. But we might still work with you going forward. And we won't like immediately penalize you for that in terms of like how we select orchestrators. Instead, we keep track of how often you're failing fast verification. And if that frequency ever exceeds a certain threshold, that's when an actual penalization would happen. So let's say like the frequency at which you're failing exceeds kind of the threshold, which might be around like 1% or 2% over a certain time period. That's when the broadcaster may use what we call like a local ban policy to kind of remove the orchestrator from consideration for a period of time. So just completely remove the orchestrator from the broadcaster's selection process for all streams until a certain period of time. But only doing that based on the frequency of failed verification, as opposed to every single time a failed verification event happens, you get added to the local ban policy, because you want to avoid kind of misinterpreting one scenario for another, like misinterpreting someone that actually was behaving perfectly honestly with someone that is behaving maliciously. So that's the one additional detail here that I wanted to wrap with. This is definitely a very big consideration in the design of fast verification, to make sure that you don't misclassify certain orchestrators by mistake. So I think that's another good pausing point. So let me pause there and see if anyone has any additional questions or comments before moving on.
I think we're good. I don't see any questions in the chat either.
All right. In that case, I think that wraps up the technical portion of fast verification, which I mentioned I wanted to be the focus for this. The last thing that I'll mention regarding fast verification is going back to the release. So there's this new node software release that went out yesterday, and we talked about perceptual hashes. So this release gives orchestrators and transcoders the ability to automatically compute these perceptual hashes. The specific implementation that we are using in this first release is called an MPEG-7 video signature, which is actually something that was open source and has been in the video industry for a little bit of time. And going forward, if orchestrator/transcoder is using this new release, if they're using a CPU for transcoding, that extra computation will happen on the CPU. If a GPU is used for transcoding, that extra computation will happen on the GPU. And this is the first release with that capability. And as has been communicated, there's going to be this 2-week grace period specifically for the Livepeer.com broadcasters, which are sending the bulk of the traffic to the network today. And this 2-week grace period is just to make sure orchestrators and transcoders have an opportunity to upgrade to this new version, because they will need this capability if a broadcaster wants to use that orchestrator for fast verification. So after that 2-week grace period, if the Livepeer.com broadcasters are going to be using fast verification and your node does not support this capability, by default, the orchestrator is going to be excluded from selection because it doesn't have the capability required for the broadcaster to even run fast verification in the first place. So it's pretty important for all orchestrators and transcoders to upgrade to this release, at least this release, as soon as possible, just to ensure that after that 2-week grace period, once the Livepeer.com broadcasters start running this process, as we enter into the testing phase, that they don't just lose access to any work that they would have received otherwise. So I just wanted to reiterate that to make sure people understand, and we'll likely follow up in Discord about this topic in the next 2 weeks, just to provide some reminders. So I wanted to make that last note on fast verification. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I've got one other question. The question being, is there a chance we can do fast verification kind of between the orchestrators and transcoders prior to it getting involved with the broadcaster? Like, for instance, if you have a pool and one of your transcoders that you may not know is trying to send back incorrect data, can the orchestrator then maybe switch to another transcoder before the segments get sent back to the broadcaster where it can get penalized?
Yes, I think that should definitely be possible. Although that is not something that is implemented slash being actively worked on right now. Just merely a prioritization thing. We've been focused on getting out the broadcaster orchestrator side first. But it should, in theory, be possible for the between an orchestrator and transcoder as well. And one of the reasons that one of the kind of inputs into the design process for fast verification is that the kind of stretch ideal goal was to come up with something that could be used for that use case as well, right? So this is for like the public pool use case where if you add too much latency or overhead for that public pool because the orchestrator needs to check, it's like really expensive for the orchestrator to check the work from the transcoders, then that's just going to disadvantage the pool perpetually. But if instead you had a lighter weight process, then that could help systems like the public pool a lot. So not something that is actively being worked on right now, but could be something that is implemented based on this design.
Cool, thank you.
Yondon, just doing a quick time check. We have 10 minutes left. Were you going to go over full verification design quickly, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, so I was just gonna wrap up by briefly covering the full verification design. I won't go into full detail here just because there's a lot, and also this is not as immediate relative to fast verification, but I'll just wrap up by talking a little bit about the next step, like what full verification is and what the next steps there are. So maybe like 2-3 minutes for that.
Yeah, that's
Is that
great.
is that cool, Shannon?
Yeah, that sounds great. And maybe, I mean, I would find this helpful. I don't know if others would. Putting this in a timeline context, like you mentioned, there's a 2-week grace period for the software node upgrade. Like when we look at full verification, what is that time horizon? That would be interesting.
Yep. So yeah, to start off with, as Doug mentioned, full verification is like the second prong here. And even though it's not as far along as fast verification, wanted to present it because I think it's important to frame fast verification as a part of the bigger picture. And what full verification would give us is basically the ability to make it more expensive for orchestrators to misbehave at all. So fast verification gives us ability to do some kind of real-time checks. Full verification just tries as much as possible to discourage any of that to happen in the first place by giving the broadcaster the ability to acquire evidence that misbehavior happened and giving the broadcaster ability to report that to a third party, i.e. the rest of the network, in order to apply said penalty. So what full verification is going to revolve around at a high level is that this happens after the fact, so not immediately. So as a live stream happens, the broadcaster is going to have the ability to periodically check segments in the background. And based on that check, based on that verification algorithm, which is going to be a little more expensive than fast verification, which is why it happens in the background. It's going to collect a body of evidence that indicates whether an orchestrator misbehaved or not. And then that evidence can be used as an input into this dispute resolution system that is also described in detail in the forum post. There's a few decisions that need to be made there, technically speaking, but at a high level, the idea is that if you have signed evidence, so evidence with a signature from the orchestrator of video that was not transcoded properly, you're able to actually report that to the rest of the network. So basically post this on chain. And then the arbitration process would determine whether the dispute is valid or not. So was the video actually transcoded correctly, or was the video transcoded incorrectly? And if the dispute goes through, the orchestrator would be slashed. And what slashing means can depend. It might mean actually taking away stake. It might mean freezing the stake for a period of time, losing access to work. That's a detail to be discussed. And how the arbitration happens, there's a number of choices here that I enumerate some of them in the forum post, from the more simpler approaches like a multi-sig all the way to more fancy game theoretic systems. So I'll stay light on the details there, but that's another detail that needs to be filled in as well, although there's certainly candidate choices there. So ultimately, the purpose of full verification is acquiring evidence, being able to report that evidence as a part of a dispute, and then arbitrating that dispute so that a penalty can be applied. So that's like a high level description. And as I mentioned, there's some remaining details that need to be filled in, such as the choice of an initial arbitrator implementation, what slashing actually entails, and those would be necessary in order to complete an initial design. So looking forward, what's the timeline for this? Fast verification is currently being rolled out. So we talked about the 2-week grace period, the new release, activating fast verification on broadcasters, testing and aggregating data. So that's moving along on one track. This separate track that's going to happen in parallel is the completion of an initial full verification design. And this is important because unlike fast verification, this would involve protocol changes. So this is definitely something that we would want to go through the governance process for. So I think the next steps here are that let's define an initial arbitration implementation. Let's define an initial penalty implementation. And then create a pre-proposal with initial specs for what a full verification protocol upgrade would look like and get community feedback on that pre-proposal. So I think that's something that will happen in the next month or so while fast verification is being rolled out. So on one hand, the network is going to be activating fast verification, and simultaneously we'll be working through the feedback and kind of construction process for the full verification proposal so that after this period of time can move on to actually implementing what's required. So that's the current sketch of what the timeline could look like and the current thought process for how to best proceed here. And I think on all of these things, especially because this is something that's going to go through the governance process, welcome thoughts, feedback on the forum post. Really appreciate, I think, from TitanNode and others, initial comments here. And I think all those really help inform what a design could look like and what the initial design should look like as we proceed in the next month.
That's great, Yondon. Thanks so much. And maybe just to get feedback from folks on the call is as we think about these quarterly transcoder calls, which so far have been happening every 3 months. Yondon, given that you said a pre-proposal could be coming up within the next month or so, question whether we want to make these calls monthly. I know that Dion has also been more active in the Discord, and he's launched weekly office hours, water coolers on Mondays as places where the transcoder community can get together weekly and talk about stuff that's going on. So yeah, thinking about, this is going to stay on the agenda. We have some other items, Yondon, I think, on the horizon that we want to engage with the Orchestrator community on as well around Confluence.
Yeah, we've mainly been focused on verification just because it's the most immediate. Things are actually being rolled out, which is exciting. And of course, we just talked about some of the research and kind of design work for full verification. Separately, I think the other big thing that we think is really important for the community and the network is Confluence, which is the name that we've given for this protocol upgrade, with the big theme of enabling more participation through lower transaction costs. And we have a pre-proposal out for that in the forum, so I'd encourage people to check that out. But what the team is currently focused on is kind of scoping the technical details so that we can move forward past pre-proposal to actually more formalized proposals. And in order to get there, we're just trying to nail the technical details so that we make sure that the changes that would go in here actually provide the necessary cost reductions. I don't think there's been as much community activity around that yet, but yeah, definitely welcome feedback there. And I think that's going to become a bigger part of the agenda as the technical details are fleshed out more.
Great. Do we have any other orchestrators on the call who want to chime in with comments or thoughts on how the core team can engage you all, what you'd like to be engaged in or have space to chat about coming forward? Okay. Dion, do you want to say how much time we have? We have 2 minutes left. Dion, do you want to promote your water cooler office hours on Monday?
Hey, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, so I did set it for Sunday because I saw that last Sunday we had a ton of activity on Discord. So we're going to just experiment with Sunday. But yeah, basically every week we get together as orchestrators or delegators or transcoders or whatever, kind of that whole ecosystem, get together and help each other troubleshoot ideas, get new orchestrators going, and just general involvement and general discussion. Last week, or I guess this week, we did it on a Monday, and it was very successful and really enjoyable, and we learned a lot. And I think also it was really nice to meet other people in the community in a more casual voice chat setting. So it's on Discord. Come join it under Water Cooler. We're going to try it for this Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So come join in, and yeah, hope to see everyone there.
Awesome.
Amazing. That's an awesome initiative. And yeah, I would offer that we can also increase the frequency of these like more technical calls to maybe once a month if that's of interest to people. So maybe we can all keep chatting about that in the Discord as well. And I've posted links in this chat to the forum post that Yondon mentioned, as well as the GitHub Go Livepeer software release, which is in the Discord announcements channel as well. And thank you everyone for being on the call. We are at time, and look forward to seeing you on the Discord. Thanks, Yondon. Doug's offline, and Dion, thanks so much for your questions as well. Okay, we'll see you all soon. Thanks.
See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Shannon.